I now have the honor of introducing Nikolay Platoshkin from Russia, who is going to be joining us, as he was not able to come to Germany. That has to do with his own background in Russia, but first and foremost, it has to do with the boycott and blockade of the West against anyone coming from Russia, where visas are only being issued in a very small number. But I'm very pleased that he's going to join us now from Moscow. Nikolay Platoshkin was a Soviet and later a Russian diplomat. He founded his own party, Movement for New Socialism, and from I think it was 2021, he ran as a candidate in the presidential elections, for which he was persecuted in Russia. There were raids of his home, and he has been forced to remain in domestic custody at home, can't leave his house. Unlike what we're reading in the media here, he can tell us something very interesting because he can report on. I'd like to give the floor now to Nikolay Platoshkin in Russia.
Guten Tag, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, sehr geehrte
Ladies and gentlemen, comrades, a very good afternoon to you. I hope you can hear me. There's a lot of snow here in Moscow, and I'm joining you from there. First of all, I want to thank you for the honor of being able to speak to you at this event run by the Junge Welt. As a young Soviet student in 1982, every day I read Junge Welt in the supposedly totalitarian Soviet system. You could subscribe to hundreds of different newspapers. So when Junge Welt was published on Monday, I got it on Tuesday in Moscow in my mailbox. So first of all, I want to appeal to the decent Germans for the fact that in Eastern Germany, the Soviet war graves and monuments are still being cared for, because there are very few states in Europe that do this. In others, Soviet memorials to the heroes of war have been pulled down. I mean, the war memorials have to keep being recreated. We have to honor those who died fighting fascism. The chair earlier on said it very clearly. It sometimes seems that it's 1941, 1942 again, when a German chancellor can say Slawa Ukraini. That basically means Sieg Heil. Why? Because that is the slogan of the organization of the Ukrainian nationalists, who are banned in Germany. And in Poland, one of the leaders was put in prison for 3 years. This is a new law in Poland, 2018. It was only just passed in Poland, condemning this. But all the same, we are looking with great interest to see whether it's going to be like 1941 or 42 again, whether German tanks will once again role in Ukraine. For the government in Kiev, for the Bandera, who is considered a hero by the Ukrainians, German tanks are the last hope, as well as for the collaborators from 42-43. It is not the case that it is, that if these tanks come, there will be thousands of people dying on both sides. It's not just that, though. It's also that the Ukrainian leadership will take this as something to escalate the war, and then what your conference's motto, stopping the Third World War, will become more and more urgent. I'm speaking to German speakers primarily today, and one of the biggest streets in Kiev was called Vatukin Street. Vatukin was the marshal of the Soviet Union who liberated Kiev in 1943. Now it's called Roman Shuchevich Street. And those of you who lived in East Germany will know that he was one of the Nachtigall organization, Theodor Oberlander. In 1960, he was actually expelled from the German army as well. The Germans reported that this was the vote of a light pogrom. But it wasn't a light pogrom. It was a terrible pogrom. And now we are looking and seeing that in Ukraine, the so-called veterans of the SS Division Galizien, which Heinrich Himmler inaugurated, are now equated with the veterans of the Red Army. And the history, I want to say this to Germans, is repeating itself. When did fascism begin? 33. Well, it began with banning the Communist Party and with the fire in the Reichstag, which the Nazis organized and blamed the communists blamed it on the communists. And what did everything start in 2014 with Ukraine? With the so-called Lenin case. The Russian Lenin apart, all Lenin memorials within 1 month were destroyed. Secondly, the Communist Party of Ukraine was immediately banned. At least 2 members of the Communist Party in 2014 died in the coup, and no one cared. And afterwards, there was the Reichstag fire equivalent, an actual fire in Odessa, which was on the Black Sea state, which was mainly Russian speakers. This was a place where a resort where many came to, like a spa. On the 2nd of May, 2014, 48 people in Odessa in the workers' building were burned by the fascists. I wasn't an eyewitness, but I have a friend who escaped death there. He was beaten, and they thought he was dead, and he was thrown out of the window from the 2nd floor, and he just crashed to the ground but hid in a bush. And he said, Michael, Lenin saved my life. And I'm like, what? Lenin saved your life? And he said, yeah, in the trade union building where the activists were beaten to their deaths, there was still a lot of volumes written by Lenin, and he took a bunch of books and put them under his jacket, and then he was beaten. And if he hadn't had Lenin books in his jacket protecting his body, he would have died. So my question is, this took place in 2014 on the 2nd of May, 48 people killed, and who was punished? Nobody. So the entire revolution, as it were, in Kiev, where more than 100 people were killed in the metropole, in the most important square, more than 100 people were shot. And who's behind that? Allegedly no one. The Ukrainian courts are silent. I knew a Ukrainian historian, Oleg Buzina, who in 2015, in front of his own doorstep, was shot because he said once the Russians and Ukrainians lived in the same city. Really nothing, a very trivial statement, but for that he was shot. 2 people volunteered as nationalists, said they'd killed him, and they were released without punishment. But what's particularly painful to me, as I said, the Germans care for the memorials to those who died in the war, the Soviet soldiers who died in the war, but they beat veterans in Ukraine, veterans of the Red Army, even women. And all of this is happening in Europe. Now imagine just for a moment that this took place in Norway. If Vidkun Quisling was suddenly described as a national hero, and the streets would be named after him. Of course, everyone would respond to that negatively, but the same thing's happening in Ukraine. Before all of this had happened, people's voices were silenced. In Kharkov, for example, in 2014, a man was just shot because his T-shirt said UDSSR on it. USSR. He was just killed for that T-shirt because USSR is not to be mentioned. And what's happening, these things are happening in Ukraine, and I think I have a right to speak about that because I am a member of the opposition in Russia. The Russian state sanctions me. They have taken my passport from me because I am not allowed to leave the house. My wife, because of my sentence, who ran as a candidate for the State Duma to replace me, she didn't even want to do that. She's an accountant. She didn't want to do that, but she was sanctioned as well. But from the West. Why? Because in the parliament, she was voted in favor of acknowledging the two republics in Donetsk. And I was like, my wife was elected by the Russians. So why would she ask in the German parliament whether or not she's done the right thing or not? I mean, is that a democracy? And what's the way out? That's what I want to ask. Actually, one last comment that might be of interest to you. A number of volunteers, even Russian soldiers now, there in Ukraine, are fighting with a red flag and have small red bands on their sleeves. And the republics in Donbass are called People's Republics, and they have red stars on them, on their crest. And why? Because these people are not necessarily aspiring to Russia today, but the Soviet Union, the time when Russians and Ukrainians and all the other ethnicities lived together. And in the Soviet Union, whether it was Donbass or Crimea, no one cared who they belonged to. The moderator anticipated this as well. What are we seeing here? That the Green Party, which came from the peace movement, allegedly, is in favor of the delivery of heavy armaments to Ukraine. The Brazilian president, Lula da Silva, for example, have been called on to be a mediator for peace agreements, but we want real peace. But you'll be asking, what should the future look like so that we can get to peace and really avoid a Third World War? Well, Austria, the solution is Austria, if you ask me. A state agreement which sets out neutrality and guaranteeing that nationalism doesn't emerge again. 1945, Austria responded to this. Germany didn't. And Austria's doing well. Austria didn't want to join NATO. Why not? But they're doing really well without it. And the free referendum, the free voting and free elections there would be a solution for peace. Because explain to me, as the left of Europe, why is it possible that Scotland can vote on independence? Quebec in Canada has had a number of referendums. South Sudan, who gained its independence through referendums, but people in Ukraine can't. For example, I've been told by Americans that Kosovo cannot belong to the Yugoslavians because we don't want it. And that's the right of self-determination of Kosovo. The last time that the population of the Soviet Union voted on our self-determination was on the 17th of March, 1991. I took part in this vote as a Soviet Union, and the question was very simple. Are you in favor of keeping the Soviet Union or not? 77% of the population asked, and no one said to me that that referendum was faked or falsified, voted in favor of keeping the Soviet Union. And then Ukraine left the Soviet Union, infringing this referendum, but no one sent tanks or an air force to oppress that. What happened in 2014, dear European left? On the 9th of May 2014, millions of people in Donbass cast their votes and were asked if they want to become independent, stay with Ukraine, or join Russia. And there were huge queues in Donbass to cast votes, and it was a very clear response. And how did the democratic Ukrainian leadership respond to that? They sent tanks, and many people who were queuing in front of the ballot boxes were actually taken down. They bombed the big cities of Donetsk and Lugansk. And now the UN says, and the UN is likely right, that after the war negotiations, 7,000 civilians have died, which of course we very much regret, but since 2014 to 2022, 13,000 people have died in Donbass, and this is UN numbers. Thus, we are in favor of negotiations. Left-wing forces, you know that in March there were negotiations and the agreement was ready to sign, but after that the first weapons came, and then we thought we probably wouldn't need this agreement.
Well, it seems that we're in a very similar situation like in 1983 with the missiles. Millions took to the street in Germany to ban these missiles to be deployed in Germany because they were afraid of a Third World War. Now, you may wonder what was the effect of all of that. The missiles were deployed ultimately, but still, the resistance was so strong that 3 years on, 1987, all those cruise missiles were banned through an agreement between the United States and Russia. Now it's up to the peace movement in Germany. We need to follow the tradition of Rosa-Luxemburg, who I believe on this very day, 1919, was killed and murdered by reactionary soldiers. We need to follow the tradition of Vladimir Lenin, who I don't find under the portraits of left personalities, but he was a real man of peace. And I call to the Germans and ask them, help the Chancellor. May sound weird. Help the Chancellor. I believe, maybe I'm wrong, I think Chancellor Scholz is the last resisting force against the supply of heavy weapons to Ukraine. Many are saying if the Germans supply tanks, we will also supply them. That's what we hear from Italy, from France, from Poland and other countries. And this will mean the death of another couple of thousands of people. The Ukrainian blood is as valuable like the Russian blood, because I grew up in the Soviet Union, and my wife is from Ukraine and the Donbas region. This was of no importance during the time of the Soviet Union. I, for one, don't like neckties. The last time I been wearing a necktie was in 1920 before I got arrested. Why am I wearing it? Not because I want to distinguish myself from you, dear comrades. The point is that the Western European left movement needs to reorient themselves profoundly. The era of 1968 should finally be over, and as the moderator said, we're discussing in the left camp in Western Europe about a lot of different topics like global warming, which is an important topic, of course, equality between genders, which is something that Soviet socialism brought in deeds and not in words. I think the left need to reconsider their core values, social equality, an alternative to capitalism. We don't need to build up a better capitalism. We need to replace capitalism with peaceful means. And this is why I'm wearing this necktie. We, the left in Western Europe, in Russia, we need to be an alternative. We need to be progressive, but also statesmanlike. We cannot be put down and brushed aside as some weird guys who at times utter something clever, but what's it all good for? Now, we in Russia, and that is what I promise, we will never rename ourselves like the communists in Italy just to gain a couple of percentage points by voters. We're going to stay the Communist Party, and we will stay being the movement for a new socialism. And many people are telling me socialism is just the old socialism. No, socialism is modern, is chic, is in. And this is what I want to conclude with, socialism is peace, and capitalism is war. This is what Marx wrote, Engels and Lenin wrote, and this is what they wrote many years ago, but which still holds true. And therefore, please reconsider, get back to your core values. Otherwise, the right movement will come up just like they did in 1933 in Germany, the National Front, the Alternative for Germany, AfD. This is something that not the right people vote for. But many voters who used to vote for the left party are voting in favor of the AfD because they can't see a difference anymore between mainstream and left. We need to be an alternative, fresh, with or without necktie. We need to be statesmanlike, and we should not be ashamed to use words like socialism and communism. Dear guests, our flag here in Russia remains being red. My home country that I'm proud of is the Soviet Union, and our shared future is the new socialism, as I hope. Thank you very much. Well, unfortunately, I can't see you in the audience, but I can hear your applause. Thank you very much for it. And if there are any questions, and if that is permitted, I may be able to answer them. So thank you very much for this very warm reception. Nikolay, we want to thank you for your input from Moscow, from your office or from at home. You wished questions to be permitted from the audience. You were faster with the presentation, so we have room for questions to Nikolay Platoshkin. So if there are any questions, fire away. The social situation in Russia. Do you want to say something about that, Nikolay, for a couple of minutes or so?
Wenn ich zum Beispiel den nächsten Rednern hier auf die Füße trete, die auch gerne was sagen würden,
I probably think that there are other speakers who also want to get room on the stage. Well, Nikolay, you still have a couple of minutes, and if you want to say something about the social situation in Russia, let us know. Well, my wife is a member of the Communist Party, and she's also a member of the movement for new socialism. The Communist Party is a wide left front. 1/3 of the members of parliament are trade unionists, and from other organizations are not party members. Why am I saying this? We travel through Russia every month, and we don't stay in five-star hotels. We go to hospitals, reach out to schools. We reach out to those people to whom we want to talk. The social situation in Russia, if I can borrow the words of Lenin, who described it as follows, he said that in Germany at his time, a wartime socialism was erected, and which would bring Germany closer to a real socialism, because the state starts intervening in the economy much stronger than they wanted to, they had to. And I think something similar is happening in Russia. Now, we're suffering from the brutal Western sanctions, and as a result of that, the state needs to get back to the core tasks of economy activities. We started again building Russian cars, Russian planes. 30 years of capitalism, it didn't add much to our industrial capacity, and people start getting back to the red flag. The popularity of socialist ideas is just widely spread, because the idea was, and the perception was, that there were a lot of things that we had during the Soviet times. We had cars, planes, and a physicist was asked whether they can build these things, and the answer was, yes, we can build everything that doesn't contravene the fundamental laws of physics. That was his answer, and we are in a similar situation. And this comparison, and if we look at where we stand today and were at the Soviet Union times, the answer is very strongly in favor of the Soviet Union. So, as I said, we hope that with the development of the international situation, socialism is getting closer. Allow me a last comment. How come that so many states, like the United States, want to intervene in Ukraine? Brzezinski once said, you will remember it, Ukraine plus Russia is the new Soviet Union. And this is what they wanted to avoid. And we want to do everything to make that possible. We want to re-establish the Soviet Union by peaceful means, through elections. Well, these are wonderful concluding remarks. Nikolay Platoshkin, thank you very much. And a big round of applause for you. And Sebastian told us Nikolay wasn't able to come here for various reasons, and unfortunately there are many people who can't be here for a variety of reasons, and some of these reasons are that they are political prisoners. Thank you very much. So thank you very much for having me.